So I want to talk to you today about business courts. There's a pilot program happening in Jefferson County, but I want to know what kind of cases will be heard in a business court and what it means for the rest of the court system, if we implement business courts statewide.
Well, business courts are new to Kentucky, but not new to the country. There are about 24 states across the country that have business courts. There are different formulations of business court, but what they all have in common, and what will occur here in Jefferson County, is a specialized docket that hears cases, primarily cases between businesses, intra-business disputes, perhaps business torts, contracts. It's not necessarily anything that involves a corporation or an LLC or a partnership. Just because one of the parties to the action is a business doesn't mean it necessarily lands in business court. We are working now with a business court docket advisory committee on drafting the rules, and there'll be very specific rules about which cases qualify for business court. But business and commercial litigators are very involved in that committee, and we're defining what goes to business court and what doesn't. And for example, if an employee sues for employment discrimination, that would not go to business court. That doesn't fit under the rubric of a business dispute. Or if someone happened to slip and fall in a store, that's not a business and commercial action. But we have very carefully drafted rules that are, I would emphasize, part of this pilot project. Because one of the things we know from our own experience here in Kentucky with pilot projects such as the family court 30 plus years ago, and what we know from talking to business judges in other states, is that you do need to pilot it and put some initial rules out there and then learn from your experience. What does it mean for the rest of the state? Well, before we implemented this pilot project in Jefferson County, which incidentally we hope and think realistically it will be up and running January of 2020, we looked at the caseload around the state and where the business and commercial litigation cases were. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of them were here in Jefferson County or they were in Fayette. So we are following basically the Tennessee model. They piloted business courts in Nashville, and once they realized after a couple of years' experience what a valuable enterprise it was, then they exported it to Memphis and Knoxville. So we anticipate doing the same thing. There are 120 counties in Kentucky. How would it become statewide initially? That remains to be seen, but certainly some jurisdictions, for example, North Carolina, have regional business courts. And I don't think, given how a business court works, there would ever be a business court in each of the 120 counties. It simply wouldn't be justified, and you would not have the personnel, the multiple judges you need to make it work. But I do envision that success in Jefferson and then later in Fayette could lead to regional business courts, so that if you had a case anywhere in Kentucky, you could choose to go to a regional business court to have it resolved.
Now, you touched on something that I want to ask about as well, and that's how many judges are needed. So would this require more judges than we currently have? And what qualifies a judge to preside over a business court?
Well, the short answer is we won't be having additional judges. We'll be using judges who are already part of the system. The Business Court Project grew out of the Civil Justice Reform Commission, which I chair, which consists of 21 people across the state involved in the mission of improving civil justice in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Chief Justice Minton organized that commission just short of 2 years ago, and we went to a conference in Little Rock, Arkansas that was attended by judges from a number of states, and that's really where the concept of the business court became clear to us as a quick way to improve civil justice generally in Kentucky. To the business community and business and commercial litigators, which I can appreciate. That's my background. Before I became a judge, I spent 15 years as a business and commercial litigator. To people who do that kind of work, it's appealing because you do have the opportunity to go to a court with specialized rules, specialized judges, to address that type of litigation in a way that you might not get in a general civil litigation docket. So when we went to Little Rock, we came back, a dozen went, members of the judiciary and the legislature, lawyers, one of our clerks here in Kentucky. We came back and we knew that we wanted to prioritize business courts. And so we've moved, I think, quite expeditiously over the last 15 months to put that together and to make it a reality. And we believe that it will make a difference, not just for business and commercial litigants, but for civil litigants generally, because it will put those cases into a specialized docket. Now, the judges, we made the decision that to make it successful, and we learned this from our sister states, you need people who are committed to it. So I became the person who went out and talked to the judges and explained to them what we were trying to accomplish and asked for volunteers. So we have two judges here in Jefferson County, Judge Angela Bissick and Judge Charlie Cunningham, who stepped up and volunteered. And they have been working with a special committee that we have, the Business Court Docket Advisory Committee, that consists of 11 practitioners, all of whom, one of them is actually a transactional lawyer, but the other 11 are business and commercial litigators. And we've been meeting regularly to draft rules and to just get our hands around how should this look at the opening of business court, and then we'll have their expertise. And if you look around the room at the meeting of that Business Court Docket Advisory Committee, I'm thinking, you know, we probably have close to 300, maybe more years of experience in business and commercial litigation. So that group has been invaluable in helping us figure out how do we pilot this. But we will do it in a way that it does not involve additional judges. It involves volunteers. Some may have a business and commercial background, others may not, but they've been on the bench for a number of years and they're dedicated to implementing it in a way that will be successful for Kentucky.
And in terms of implementing it, what kind of resources would this require? So it probably won't require more judges, like you said, but would it require additional resources? I mean, courthouses, anything like that?
We don't foresee that. At this juncture, two judges, as I said, here in Jefferson County will be the business court docket judges, and those judges will take all of the business court cases. By having two judges, you have a situation where for some reason one judge has to recuse, you have another business court judge. They can also be resources to each other. We're fortunate in Kentucky, we have a unified court system, which not every state does. And if you travel across the country and you meet judges from all around the U.S., you realize that the unified court system that was created back in the mid-'70s with the judicial article gives the court a huge advantage that many states don't have. And that's because there's a consistency and a uniformity in how things are handled in the courts across the state. We have an administrative office of the courts which provides the resources in terms of technology, because yes, this will require some technology and some changes in the software and how cases are assigned. We are fortunate that every circuit judge in Kentucky is entitled to a law clerk, and a law clerk, I think, is going to be the law clerks will be very instrumental in making this work for the judges, and so those resources will be used. But in terms of new courthouses or an additional outlay, I mean, we Chief Justice Minton and those of us on the Supreme Court were very realistic. And we realize that we need to make this work within the current financial parameters, and that's our intent.
You brought up a couple other states, Tennessee, North Carolina. I know there are multiple states working on business courts, either in pilot programs or fully implemented. Kentucky often likes to say, we looked at every other state, see what they did right and what they did wrong, and then we crafted our model. So what have you seen? You said you guys are kind of following the Tennessee model, but what are some of the best cases of best practices and worst practices?
Well, one of the things I would point out is, as I mentioned, we have a number of experienced practitioners on this committee, and several of those, in fact, I think virtually everyone has practiced in a business court in another state. So we have the experience of people who've been to those states. We obviously have their rules, their forms. We've made contact with judges from a number of states. At the Kentucky Bar Association convention this summer, we had Judge Gale from North Carolina, a longtime business judge there. Now, their business judges are separate in the sense that all they do is business court. So they do operate separately from the other judges in the state. We're working within our system, and as I said, using elected judges who've been on the bench for a number of years and who are willing to undertake the docket. One of the advantages that we have, because we are a unified court system, is that once we figure out what works here, we will take those same rules and practices to Lexington and to the other locations. Some states, for example, Florida, is not a unified court system. And as a consequence, when business courts sprang up around the state, you would discover that practicing in business court in Miami could be very different from business court in some other city in Florida, because the rules would be different. And the value of what we plan to implement is consistency. We'll figure out what works, we'll adopt rules for the business court here in Jefferson County, and we anticipate those same rules will apply in Fayette. And so that way, any practitioner or party to a lawsuit in Kentucky will know that if they go to business court, yes, there'll be different judges, that's always the case, but the rules, the procedures, the processes, to the extent we'll have a few forms, all of that will be the same. So there'll be some uniformity and consistency. And to go back to your earlier question about what does it mean statewide, we anticipate that once the business docket is up and running, that these business judges will post some of their decisions, which I think will be helpful. And they'll be available to circuit judges, say, in Pike County or McCracken County. And so even though they might not have business court in the other parts of the state, they can benefit from the experience of judges in Louisville and eventually Lexington who have a steadier diet, if you will, of business litigation and deal with the business and commercial statutes and rules and common law more than those judges in other jurisdictions might. So I think there will be a beneficial effect throughout the state. I anticipate that our business court judges will probably become informal resources to their colleagues around the state. I know from my years as a circuit judge, there's a lot of collegiality, and judges talk with each other and exchange experiences, and I would suspect that a lot of judges will be willing to reach out to Judge Cunningham or Judge Bissick and benefit from their experience as business court judges.
So coming off a discussion about other states implementing business courts, do you feel that this is the type of initiative that could make Kentucky be seen as more competitive by businesses?
Well, I certainly think it's a positive thing. It says that the court system, the Court of Justice in Kentucky, is committed to improving civil justice, and the court system sees business courts as a positive thing. And I think from my conversations, not only with the very experienced members of my advisory committee, but also with other lawyers across the state, they see it as a very positive thing. There are actually a number of things about being in state court that are more favorable than being in federal court. And several of these experienced practitioners from the large law firms around the state have said, if we get this up and running and it's done well, which we fully expect to do, they believe that the state courts may well become the more favored choice. And obviously, federal courts, the statutes dictate the jurisdiction, and not every case qualifies to go to federal court. But the advantages of business court is that you will have dedicated judges. And when I say dedicated, I need to step back and say for a minute that in Kentucky, by statute, all judges have civil and criminal, all circuit judges have civil and criminal jurisdiction. And these judges will continue to have a criminal docket consistent with their statutory responsibilities. But their civil docket will be adjusted to allow for the fact that they are the business court judges here in Jefferson County. And we believe that that sort of concentrated effort, that experience will initially and as time goes by lead to more effective and more efficient handling of business court cases. So a lot of these rules that we're adopting are providing for early conferences. They're making it a very judge-driven, hands-on experience, which should move it through the system more quickly than business litigation frequently does now.
You brought up the Civil Justice Task Force, including many members of the bench and legislators. And this was part of these discussions.
Exactly.
What other policies and initiatives do you expect to come out of that group in the next couple of years?
Well, we made the decision that we wanted to make progress and we wanted to make it quickly, but we wanted to be responsible in the scope of our efforts. So the initial focus was on business courts. We have now begun a focus on what's called case triage. And case triage would apply across the board to all civil litigation. And it's simply an emphasis on assessing cases early on, hence the triage, and determining what type of track best fits the needs of that litigation, and then adopting rules or processes that keep that case on track instead of just sort of letting it languish. I think one of the business court judges from Florida described it best. We have for a long time in Kentucky, like virtually every state, if not every state in the union, in the civil justice arena, we have allowed the speed of the case and the progress of the case to be largely dictated by the attorneys, the friction between the plaintiff and the defendant. And so sometimes a judge would not even know a case was on his or her docket until the first disagreement, and then they motion to see the court and they come in for a pretrial or whatever. And that friction between the plaintiff and the defendant is what has moved the case forward. By contrast, in the criminal docket, someone comes in and they're arraigned, and the circuit court judge immediately sets usually a 20 or 30-day date for a pretrial. And then there are regular expectations that are applied to that criminal case until it gets to trial. It's more judge-driven, if you will. And I think that case triage takes that concept and applies it, just as the business court model does, to civil cases, so that cases are marched through the process, if you will, more aggressively by the judge, instead of sitting back and waiting for the friction between the plaintiff and the defendant to drive the case forward.